And let me show you in this next chart. This is sort of the other heart of our presentation. This is the red line here is the top marginal tax rate. And many of you remember that in the 1970s, the highest income tax rate was 70%. It fell to 50% and then 28% under Reagan, and went up a little bit under Bush and Clinton, and it came down a little bit under George W. Bush. But the important point here is the top income tax rate in the United States came down from 70% at the start of the period all the way down to 35% at the end of the period. That's a big decline in tax rates. That's a cutting in the tax rates in half. And here's the most amazing thing. I wish Barack Obama and his economic advisor were sitting at this table right here so I could explain this to him. Look at what happens to the share of taxes paid by the wealthiest 1%. That's the blue line. And this is the heart of the Laffer curve argument. The richest 1%, when we had a top tax rate of 70%, paid less than 20% of all income taxes. They paid 19.5% of all income taxes when we had a 70% tax rate. Today, with a 35% tax rate, the richest 1%, all Americans in that top 1% category, I'm talking about, the evil rich, people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and Tiger Woods and Hannah Montana and people like that. Those top 1%, they pay 40% of the income tax today. That means 1 out of 100 pay 40%, the highest level ever. Another way to think about this is just showing the same point. The top 1% pay 40% of the income tax. Even more amazingly, the bottom 50%, all Americans with an income below the median in the United States, pay 3% of the income tax today. So that is to say the top 50% pay 97%, the bottom 50% pay 3%. And yet the entire news out of Washington is we have to tax the rich because they're not paying their fair share. Let me show you. By the way, I would make the case to you that if we raise the income tax rates like Barack Obama wants to do, the share of taxes paid by the top 1% will fall. It will not rise. If you want to get more revenues out of rich people, the enduring lesson of the last 50 years is you cut their tax rates, you don't raise them. And by the way, that's an important lesson for you all as state legislators, because I know that almost half the states now are facing a situation where they're trying to soak the rich. If you do that, you're not going to get more money out of the rich people. You're going to lose your rich people. And of course, how many Californians are there in this room? A few of you. I mean, you know this lesson very well. The people of Nevada and Washington and Texas would like to thank you for raising your taxes so many times, because all those people are moving out of the state. This is the Laffer curve, and most of you know this, that there's two rates. You can get zero revenues at 0 and 100%, and you want to be in the range, obviously, where rates are low, not high, because you get more economic development. And of course, the reason I like to show this is because when I was writing the book with Arthur, I always asked him why he wrote the chart this way rather than this way, and he told me that he was teaching college at that time, and the boys were never paying attention in class, so he figured if he made it look like a woman's breast, they would pay close attention. So anyway, you probably didn't know you were going to hear all about women's breasts and peckers in this presentation. Okay. Inflation, the other reason the economy did so well in the 1980s and 90s was we brought inflation down. This was one of the Gipper's greatest accomplishments. As you can see here, that how many of you remember 14.5% inflation rate in 1980? How many of you remember 20% mortgage interest rates? Remember that? How many remember gasoline lines? I mean, all of those things were functions of the dysfunctional policies we had in place in the 1970s. Look at what the Gipper accomplished. In the first year in office, the inflation rate went from 14.5% down to 3%. The Gipper understood that inflation was, just as Milton Friedman taught us, too many dollars chasing too few goods. And you can see during the great period of prosperity, inflation was under control in this whole period. Now, why is that an important thing to understand today? Let me show you this. This is the reason, and some of you may recognize this from a piece that Art Laffer had in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. The money creation that is going on in Washington today is unprecedented in the last 50 years. You look at what happens to this chart. This is the rate of growth of the money supply, and you can see what happens in October of 2008. It just goes straight up. I have a friend who works at the Treasury Department who literally told me, he works in the Monetary Policy Division, he said, literally, the printing presses at the Treasury are going 24/7. He said, the only thing, Steve, that can slow us down is if we run out of ink. And he wasn't much, exaggerating. What is the impact? What is the long-term impact of that money creation? You all know. It's inflation. And I think we're starting to see it. You saw the numbers that came out today. So this is a spooky situation. We're borrowing money at record levels, and we're printing the money to finance that spending. This is an interesting chart, too. This shows you the areas of the economy where prices are most out of control. Now, obviously, energy is a special case, but look at education and medical care. Those are the two industries where over the last 8 years we've had the most growth of inflation. And why is that an interesting finding? It's because who runs those two industries, education and medical care? Well, education is 90% run by government, and as Rich Vedder shows very well in his book, when you have the government running an industry and when prices aren't working, you have massive inflation in costs, and that's why college tuition costs are going up so much in your state. And look at medical care, up 35%, when in fact when you look at other areas like new vehicles and apparel and software and computers, prices have been falling. It shows the complete folly of the Obama administration's idea that if only we had the government running 100% of the healthcare system, we would be able to control costs. Exactly the opposite will happen if we go that route. I'll just show you a couple more charts and then I'll turn it over to Arthur. Here's the big problem. Look at what's happened. This is the reason I think that Republicans, and I know that this is a bipartisan organization, but I got to take a minute to really attack the Republicans in this room for a minute, and not you personally, but some of my friends in the Congress. Look, the reason that Republicans are in such disrepute in the United States today, and there's no question that although Barack Obama's opinion numbers are falling, Republicans are still not very well liked, especially on the national level, by voters. And the reason for that is shown in this graph. Look at what happened when Republicans took over the Congress and the White House in 2001. We saw the biggest explosion of spending that we've seen in 60 years. Republicans, and by the way, I worked with Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey during the Republican Revolution, and you can see when Republicans took over the Congress in the first 5 years, the federal spending was kept under control. That's the reason we had a balanced budget by 2000. But what was just inexcusable is what happened after 2001. The federal budget exploded, and not just the defense budget. And by the way, I think that increasing defense spending was obviously the right thing to do after 9/11. But look at what happened to the non-defense budget. It exploded. And this is the reason I think Republicans have a big repair job to do. They damaged their brand with all of the spending that they did during that era. Now, if you want to know, if you just look at all of these departments, you can see that when Barack Obama says, you know, we've been underinvesting in education and infrastructure and so on, it is nonsensical. We've had the biggest explosion virtually across the board in spending. And then if you want, some of you have probably seen my analysis of this before, if you want to know where the spending really goes, this really shows you in a very detailed way how your money is being spent in Washington. And this was based on a very thorough study that we did on the federal budget. Okay.